Last year and the year before, I launched another big project that actually is taking some of these ideas and applying them to the environmental movement in the United States, looking at how the environmental movement targets the state, of course, for various kinds of regulation, for various sorts of environmental bills, but also at the way in which the environmental movement targets corporations and the way in which both firms and markets and industries and also the state impact the movement as well. And what we're trying to argue in this particular project is that there are a lot of questions that are unanswered by political sociologists and unanswered by management scholars that we really want to get some leverage over. So we begin with this project by asking questions about what the environmental movement is and what they do. And we're collecting a lot of data right now on protest and protest demonstrations. This particular photograph comes from December of 2009 at the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. This is just one example of this, but what we've been doing is looking historically at this as well and collecting protests mostly from newspaper accounts, data on protest events in the United States. And this figure just happens to show you the proportion of the protest events in our data set that target businesses. And what we see is that in many years, this approaches 40–50% of all protest events recorded in the United States around the environment targeting businesses. This is missed by political sociologists and political scientists who tend to focus only on those kinds of events that target Congress or target some sort of state target. And this, we think, is going to give us a lot of leverage in explaining what this movement does and what kinds of effects it has. We're also looking at membership data in various kinds of grassroots and non-grassroots kinds of organizations. And organizations like the Sierra Club have been very forthcoming with membership numbers for us. And we're working with other kinds of organizations to look at the number of members in these kinds of organizations and associations over time. And the idea is we're trying to get measures of environmental activity, environmental movement activity, pro-environment kinds of activities. And this is yet another measure other than protest, or that's what we're hoping to find. We are also looking at shareholder resolutions introduced in the United States. And this particular photograph comes from an event, a protest at an annual shareholder meeting at Chevron in 2008, which accompanied a shareholder resolution about the environment and environmental devastation at the hands of, in particular, Texaco in Ecuador and also Nigeria, where much toxic waste and oil was spilled in the process of drilling for oil and so on. And what we want to look at and what we've been looking at is going through the vast number of shareholder resolutions introduced in the United States at various companies, not just Chevron, and looking at the proportion of these that have something to do with the environment or environmental issues as yet another measure of what it is that the environmental movement does. And as some of you probably are aware of, there are literally hundreds of these that are introduced every year, particularly in the more recent period. And you can see that in the more recent period, approaching almost half of these have something to do with the environment. So we're working with these sorts of data to try to get a gauge of what are shareholders doing? Who are these shareholders? Who's introducing these kinds of resolutions? And what are these resolutions about? As, again, another measure of environmental the environmental movement and environmental activism. We're also very interested in looking at the way in which advocacy organizations, lobbying organizations, lobby Congress. And at this point, we're collecting data on the sort of organizations in the United States that are sort of pro-environmental kinds of lobbies. We're also interested later on in looking at the other side of this as well. But one of my colleagues, Chris Basso, estimates that the top 30 environmental advocacy organizations in the United States in 2003 had over 8 million members. We're interested in looking at membership as well as just the number of organizations that there are out there and what they're lobbying about. Some of this is easy to find from in the Post-Lobbying Disclosure Act in the more recent period, but we're also digging historically using a variety of archival sources to also get at at what these organizations were doing in the 60s and in the 70s with respect to lobbying Congress and what effect they had. Did they have any effect whatsoever on getting congressional attention to environmental issues?